diplomacy. And as you're very well aware, public diplomacy is gaining traction these days, and we would like to take this opportunity to find ways to utilize PyeongChang's spirit of peace with public diplomacy, sports diplomacy, and ODA, and also look into various practical initiatives to implement our vision. The moderator for today's session is from Daegu Catholic University, Honorary Professor Jungok, and she will be delivering her opening remarks to open up the session. Please welcome her with a big round of applause.
네, 안녕하십니까?
Ladies and gentlemen,
2년이죠, 올해.
it is now 2022. I remember how we hosted the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, and since then, the call for hope and peace has not ended. It has continued on, and the PyeongChang Peace Forum has gone on for 4 years, and I have come each year. I can say with pride that I have come every year, and that is probably why they have asked me to moderate this session. And it is an immense pride for me to do so. Before we hosted and after we hosted the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, I do believe that the Games have rewritten history. And we also have come up with the concept of the spirit of peace. The first spirit of peace, I believe, is that we have been very tenacious in trying to win the bid to host the Olympics. This tenacity is something that is very important, a huge asset for the Korean people, and I believe that this asset was in full force at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. The second spirit of peace is a passion of participation. The Pyeongchang people began the wave, which was taken up by the people of Gangwon-do, and then it was taken up by the whole people of Korea. The global village was so excited and passionate by this outcome, and they have sent their hope and their support to Pyeongchang. The win for the bid of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, I believe, was a testament to the living history to all of you. So that is why this passion of participation is the second spirit of peace. The third spirit of peace is unity between the two Koreas and reconciliation. And this is not something that impacts just the two Koreas. All countries that are in conflict or on the brink of war have sent their applause to this spirit of reconciliation. Through public diplomacy and through the means of sports, we were able to transform the mood of war to that of peace. And that is, I believe, the essence of the spirit of peace here at Pyeongchang. The fourth spirit of peace is, as you know, inclusivity. When we think about the Winter Olympics, this is something that isolates those countries that are in the southern hemisphere where there is no natural snow. So for them, this was a completely different party. However, in Pyeongchang, we invited people all across the world, and we were able to transform the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games into a global festival for all of us. And this inclusivity is a very important spirit of peace that came out of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And I believe that these different spirits of peace, even without in-depth research or study, were something that could be viscerally felt by everyone. And it's a testament to our living history, and it's an important asset to our public diplomacy. We must continue on with this legacy. In fact, the people of Pyeongchang have decided to take this up with the PyeongChang Peace Foundation to try to be systematic in their efforts to uphold this legacy. In fact, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that in the 2022 PyeongChang Peace Forum, that the spirit of peace from Pyeongchang could resonate around the world. He has sent in his congratulatory remarks to that end. I believe that this spirit of peace is ringing loud and clear, not just here in Pyeongchang, but across the world. This public diplomacy session is a way for us to talk about value diplomacy, sports public diplomacy, ODA diplomacy, which would not be difficult to do together. We have engaged in activities separately, but At this 2022 PyeongChang Peace Forum, we have for the first time tried to bring them together in a nexus through this peace public diplomacy session. And through this integrated approach would be very significant. This session is being hosted by Pyeongchang County and the PyeongChang Peace Foundation. The PyeongChang Peace Foundation has been founded to specifically and sustainably realize the legacy of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and to make sure that the call for peace would not just end here in Pyeongchang, but that it would resonate around the world. This would tie in with the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. The PyeongChang Peace Foundation will work towards that end and also engage in various Olympic-related legacy projects. All of this will be made possible by the people of Pyeongchang, the people of Gangwon-do, and Han Wang-gi, the head of Pyeongchang County, who was able to pull all these efforts together. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank all of the guests in attendance here today in the Alpensi Auditorium, all the people participating online in this session. Thank you very much, especially the people who have come here, brave the bitter cold to come here. I would like to thank Ryu Taekyeong, Jung Gi-ung, Moon Kyungyon, Song Jinho, Kim Sunggyu, Cho Suji, Lee Sung-hoon, all of our distinguished guests who have come to grace us with their presence. These guests are experts in the field of public diplomacy, not just in the area of research, but in actual practice and public administration. These are experts from various walks of life, and the fact that we have them all with us today is a testament to the passion of the people of Pyeongchang. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for giving us this opportunity to host this session here. And now, we will begin the Pyeongchang Spirits of Peace and Public Diplomacy session. Thank you.
네, 교수님께서
Professor, thank you for the opening remarks.
개회사를 통해서
And through her remarks, we were able to understand the meaning behind the Pyeongchang spirit of peace. And she also mentioned that this is an important asset in public diplomacy. And as she has mentioned, the Pyeongchang spirit of peace, I hope, will define itself as a concept of public diplomacy, and I hope that we can find a way to implement the spirit of peace. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite Mayor Han Wang-gi of Pyeongchang for his welcoming remarks. Please greet him with a big round of applause.
반갑습니다.
Welcome. I am Han Wang-gi, Mayor of Pyeongchang-gun.
공공 외교를 주제로
I would like to welcome you all to this meaningful session on Pyeongchang spirit of peace and public diplomacy. And particularly, I would like to extend my gratitude to the chair of Pyeongchang Peace Center, Professor Jungok, and all speakers and panelists.
가장
The 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics has left an important legacy, which is to achieve peace utilizing sports public diplomacy. Pyeongchang is where the Korean Penisula peace process originated from, and it's about continuing on with the peace determination of the Olympics. We put together Pyeongchang Peace Center to continue on with various legacy initiatives.
이러한 평화의 여정에서
And in this journey of peace, what's most important and necessary is to put together an action plan, and a specific action plan. Particularly in 2024, in 2023, the Youth Winter Championships and the 24 Youth Winter Olympics will take place in Gangwon province. So there are many international events to happen, and I believe that through public diplomacy and through our efforts in sports, we can bring about a great momentum of peace. The strategy and the initiatives will be brought together and devised at this session, and I believe that it will help us keep alive this momentum of the Olympics. I truly hope that you can muster your wisdom, your collaboration, so that we can have the Pyeongchang spirit of peace achieve world peace. Thank you very much.
네, 군수님 다시
Thank you very much. As the head of Pyeongchang County, who has touched upon the significance of this session with his very warm, welcoming remarks. And we hope that the actionable, realizable measures towards peace will be very important, and we hope that this session will lead to those fruitful outcomes. Now we will move on to some in-depth presentations and discussions. We would like to go in turn and introduce all of our panelists today. Our first moderator would be Jungok, who is a professor emeritus at Daegu Catholic University.
네, 계속해서 연사분 소개해 드리겠습니다.
Let me go on in turn and introduce our speakers. Taekyeong at Ewha Women's University, who is a Ph.D. candidate. Next, from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Jung is an HK professor. From Jeonbuk National University, we have Professor Kyungyon. Professor Moon is not able to join us in person. We will be watching a video. Next, I'd like to move on to our discussants in the panel.
2018 평창 동계올림픽 남북 단일팀 부주장
We have Susie, was in the inter-Korean team, one of the athletes at the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympics. From Seoul National University, we have Professor Taekyeon, who will be joining us via Zoom. Director Jinho of the PyeongChang Peace Foundation. Thank you very much. From KAIDEC, Chairman Sunggyu of the Korea Association of International Development and Cooperation. It's a pleasure to meet you. Lee Sung-hoon, or Anselmo Lee, specialized professor at the Global Academy for Future Civilization at Kyung University. I'd like to hand over the microphone to our moderator.
네, 감사드립니다.
Yes, thank you very much.
평화 공공 외교 세션 1에서
Once again, this is Peace Public Diplomacy Session 1, and we'll be talking about sports public diplomacy, value diplomacy, and also how we can make this into an ODA initiative. So we have presentations as well as a discussion session with 5 prominent panelists. Amid COVID-19, what we wanted to do was try out this hybrid format of both offline and online participants. And I think that this will be a new format for conferences and meetings going forward. In lieu of time, I would like to go right into the presentations. I would like to ask our speakers to use about 15 minutes. And for our panelists, you have 7 to 8 minutes. And I think that that will save some time for us to entertain questions from the floor.
열어보도록 하겠습니다. 많은 말씀은 이미 모두에서 드렸기 때문에
I have already given my remarks in my opening comments, so let me now move right into the presentations. First, I would like to invite Ms. Taekyeong of Ewha Women's University. She is a Ph.D. candidate, and with Professor Suk, she has been engaging in a very important research, so she's going to share the outcome of the research. And at the Australian Embassy, she was also involved in public service, and not only that, she has also been with the Navy for about 8 years, so I do know that she has a lot of insight in how we can implement upon our vision. So a big round of applause, please, for Ms. Taekyeong.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Hello,
대학교 국제대학원에서
my name is Taekyeong. I'm pursuing my Ph.D. degree at Ewha Women's University.
함께 공동으로 진행하고 있는
I'm going to work together with Professor Ki-seok to talk about our project on a presentation where we talk about
문제에 대한 성과를 보려고 하는데요.
the Moon Jae-in administration's peace initiative and value diplomacy. And we would like to try to provide with an assessment of this view, talk about South Korea's value diplomacy, frame peace as a collective norm and value, and come up with an analytical method to talk about the input-output outcome.
이 연구는 한국의 파워 다이내믹에
This
대한 아주 작은 질문.
research begins with a question on the power dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. Over the last 50 years, our diplomacy has been looking at hard power, so on military and security. Now, Korea is one of the top 10 economies in the world, and it's also one of the top 6 military powers in the world. We also have soft power through Korean wave, such as Hallyu, K-content, BTS, Blackpink, Squid Game, all of these different Korean content has made their explosive debut in the international scene, and this has led us to see that we have a lot of international standing around the world. These different assets would be very important strategically for our public diplomacy. However, when we look at the soft power ranking, if we compare with the economy or the military, there is a huge gap. In fact, we are ranked just 19th in terms of soft power. When we talk about the competitive edge that Hallyu content has, this is quite surprising. Many scholars say that soft power is closely related to hard power. We have to understand this asymmetry and see why the context is. And so we would also understand what the Korean government has done. Moon Jae-in's peace initiative
공공 노력을 가미한 정부 최우선
engages public diplomatic efforts and is one of the top agenda items for the administration.
북한이 아직 전쟁 중이라는
However, there is a negative image that Korea is still divided, that there are North Korean nuclear weapons, there is the risk and threat of war, and these are negative images hurting the brand of Korea. And this is the results of a public opinion poll that we were able to conduct, and this is also one of the reasons why we decided to engage in this research.
가치미 기범을
We have
국가 아이덴티티의 그
South Korean government
기본주의적 접근입니다.
pursuing peace and prosperity in the Korean Peninsula through public diplomacy means by seeking cooperation with regional partners in the region of the Northeast Asia and beyond. And this is a constructionist view with peace as the identity. This is norm-based. South Korea's norm diplomacy,
국익을 실현
which is a way to try to see. It's a strategy to try to pursue national interests.
정보를
In the past, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun administrations were all liberal administrations, and Moon Jae-in has also taken up the liberal administration.
이니셔티브의 세 가지 원칙을
And under him, Moon Chung-in, professor, said that we would go peace first, no nukes, and no regime change.
또 한국 정부는
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs have also said the same thing, that it will pursue peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula through its public diplomacy means by seeking cooperation with regional partners in the region of the Northeast Asia and beyond. And this is the policy measure of MOFA and ultimately the Moon Jae-in administration.
평화라는 개념을 문재인 정부가 갖고의 노력을
This concept of peace has become such an important value and strategy for Moon Jae-in. And why is that?
평화라는 가치로 그 초점
We have transitioned and pivoted from unification to peace, and there are two objects behind this. By respecting the DPRK regime, we wanted to try to engage them in dialogue, and also we wanted to expand the agenda to not just the two Koreas, but to a larger geopolitical agenda. This means that unification is just an agenda that impacts the two Koreas, but peace would be a global agenda.
프레임이라는 개념은 사회적 여러 사회
When we talk about framing,
개체끼리의 일상 속 커뮤니케이션에
this engages a lot of a communication between different actors across our society. So this theory of framing
받는 사람
means that the message that we try to communicate would be framed in such a way that it would be responded to by the recipient in a different way. So for example, as you know, there is that war on terror. The U.S. administration used that expression of war and terror, realizing that we can be both an attack and defense, and it was a very important strategic rhetoric made by the U.S. administration, and this, in fact, helped to decrease all criticism.
사회적 이슈인
The framing is not just using policy measures. For example, if we talk about same-sex marriage
러브를
or gay marriage,
더했습니다.
there was that framing of love. Love is love, that it's a values-oriented frame. And this
가치와 동등한
showcased the importance of universal love for LGBTQ minorities.
부여한 것이죠.
And this was a very positive frame placed on same-sex marriage. Similarly, right now, because there's a stalemate, the Moon Jae-in administration is attempting a reframing.
당에 따라 조금 구분을
If we look at Robert Edmonds'
상태가 평화
glossary, we can say that first of all, we have to define problems, which is a standstill situation. And there were different views on unification. This is a diagnosis of the cause.
한국과 미국의
And there is also this possibility of an absorption, a unification of the ROK in the US by DPRK. That was a fear that DPRK had. And there was also the need to come up with a more comprehensive concept to bring together and encompass all of the neighboring partners. And that was how the Moon Jae-in administration came upon the concept of peace, because this is a universal value and nobody can be antagonistic towards this. And the government engaged in various different measures to try to pursue this.
이좀 두드러지는
Under framing, there's the peace metaphor as a conceptual idea, and the story of Moon Jae-in, his family was able to escape the Korean War, and then there was the Korean people wanting unification through peaceful approach, not an undesirable war. And there was slogan, peaceful and prosperous Korean Peninsula, and using the PyeongChang Olympics. It's very strategic in terms of its approach. But how was this received? For this, we wanted to try to look at the IOO model, so input, output, and outcome, to try to look at the outcome of the policies. President Moon announces Berlin initiative at Korber Foundation, so that was the input. And in comparison, we also tried to put in another input of President Park's Dresden initiative, which was announced at the University of Dresden in 2014. We wanted to see what each of the presidents looked at in terms of peace and unification and the kind of messages that they attempted to deliver. Then we also looked at the output, which is media reports. Media reports, typically in public diplomacy, we see media reports as immediate outcome. After that output, we also looked at the outcome, such as the reactions of world leaders as well as public opinion. In 2014, President Park gave her speech at Dresden. She mentioned unification 34 times, but only 16 times for peace. Here, he said that we have to become a unified country and stop our division. President Park said that Dresden of East Germany was able to flourish after unification, and a unified Germany was able to become the center of Europe. Compared against Germany, she also said that we could have one system, one Korea. Contrarily, President Moon mentioned peace 49 times in his Berlin speech and unification 17 times. So we can see that this is a very big difference from President Park's speech. And even when he talks about unification, it wasn't about DPRK. Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, and he also was trying to emphasize that we have to have co-prosperity with the two Koreas. He has been very strict when it comes to nuclear issues, but he said that he does not want a regime collapse of the DPRK, that there needs to be coexistence and trust building between the two Koreas. And at the end of his speech, he said that to realize peace, we have to look at all of these different issues, such as terrorism and the refugee crisis, and said that Germany can overcome all of these different challenges for the sake of peace, not just for Europe, but for the world, and that the two Koreas also has to contribute to all of these different activities for the sake of Northeast Asia and the world. The output, as we can see in the media, was that in the Korean media, they said that President Moon was dreaming big dreams. And in 2017, it said that there was not a lot of movements with the DPRK, so a lot of the reports are very skeptical in nature. The domestic reports were quite skeptical, as I mentioned, but in 38 North, there was some sort of a positive spin. He said that President Moon has said that unification is not just for the two Koreas, but very prudently said that the other countries can either help or harm the efforts of the two Koreas. Korea may not be able to get complete support from the United States, but at least Korea does not want outright opposition from the other neighboring countries, and I think that this is a very accurate view. In 2014, Rudiger Frank said that it was not very complimentary about President Park's Dresden speech. He said that this is not necessarily a very sensitive document, and that it was basically negating DPRK. And he even said that the speechwriter has to be fired. If we take a look at these two speeches, the output on the NK media was also different. After just 3 days after President Park's Dresden speech, the KCNA said that this is vulgar diplomacy. And the Rodong Shinmun said that this is unification, that it goes against the people and North Korean philosophy and system. And also some very severe attacks that I cannot bring myself to say here. However, contrarily, on President Moon's Berlin speech, it took 9 days for the NK media to respond. It must have taken them time to think about this. But there was some positive recognition of Moon's gesture. In this op-ed on the Rodong Shinmun, under a personal contributor, sees that the North Korea was trying to be very careful in their approach, and he said that the New Dresden Initiative respects June 15 and October 4th declarations. This means that they were responding positively to President Moon's talk about respecting the regime of the PRK. We were able to see some positive outcome in 2018. The positive images in the outcomes we're able to see in the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. Kim Yo-jang came to the opening ceremony, and the two Koreas came to the athletes were together in the scene, and this was a huge testament to the movement for peace. And in 2018, there was the April and May Panmunjom Pyongyang meetings. In Panmunjom in April, the two leaders met and said that there is no more war on the Korean Peninsula, that we have ushered in a new era of peace. And in Singapore, Hanoi, Panmunjom, the U.S. and DPRK leaders met 3 times, and they even hugged. And it seemed that we were very close to peace. Professor Moon Jung-in said that this was a rousing success for our efforts. This was something that was felt by all of the different parties. Then 2018 and 17, if we look at the Pew Research Center survey, there was negative opinion of North Korea among Americans in just about 3 months before all of these different outcomes occurred in the spring of 2017. So you can see that unfavorable was about 78%. But in the 2018 same Pew Research Center outcome, we're able to see that there is broad public approval of U.S. talks with North Korea, that there was more approval for dialogue. This peace frame and the U.S. public opinion surveys might not be completely related, but this is a response to President Trump's movements and activities. So this is also something that we can look at positively. However, this mood did not last. The U.S. and DPRK Hanoi summit ended in a no-deal summit, and the DPRK said that we're going to cut off communications, no more ties with the U.S., and they blew up the joint liaison office in Kaesong. After Biden, there has not been a lot of movement because of COVID-19. If we look at the domestic situation in the DPRK, it does not seem likely that there's going to be a lot of movement out of North Korea. However, there is still some hope for peace. In 2021, if we look at DPRK, they have restored the communication channel. They said that we are going to try to work together. Of course, it was a recent missile launch, which was unfortunate, but President Moon Jae-in has said that in each available opportunity, he has reframed and talked again about peace when he went to Rome to meet with the Pope, or when he went to talk with the different prime ministers and heads of state. The unprecedented efforts have brought about unprecedented outcome, and this is not something that anybody can deny. Nobody can go against the universal value of peace. So on peace, he can continue to call for support, and this is a very strategic approach. However, when it goes from this transition from unification to reframing of peace, it's not easy for us to tell right now whether this has been successful. Some people have said that the reframing has not actually relevant here. If the two divided Koreas can be helpful to the neighboring countries, then even if we try to put in a peace frame, that would not be helpful. But we understand that the unified two Koreas can have a bigger impact on the economy, so that's why many people will be more receptive to the frame of peace. However, it's still too early to tell. In order to gain the interest and attention of different countries, we have to look at the approach of peace rather unification. However, as I mentioned again, it's too early for us to tell right now. However, I think that the statistics can show us a little bit of hope. Earlier on, I mentioned that the national brand image is negatively impacted because of North Korean nukes and the risk of North Korean war. That was from 2019, done by a Korean Public Culture Institute, an overseas culture institute. But what has changed since then? If we look at the 2021 national brand assessment done by KOICA, we see that the national brand image is not impacted by North Korea as the #1 factor. It has moved down to #4. And this shows that in 2021, there has been a huge, major shift in the public opinion and in the perception of the people regarding the national brand image of Korea. I was only able to share a little bit of our research outcome because of time constraints, but this is going to be a live project. It's an ongoing project. And depending on how the initiative changes, we're going to continue to stay abreast of the situation. Thank you very much.
네, 유태경님 그리고 조기숙 교수님 감사드립니다.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Ryu Taekyeong and Professor Cho. As was mentioned, compared to the security and the economy, it's true that we haven't been seeing a lot of diplomacy in the soft power, but we've been seeing the Squid Game, which actually helped us utilize culture in diplomacy. But then again, it's also a part of industry. But I think that this was a case where we've actually utilized value and to use value in diplomacy. In the US, it's democracy. For the UN, it's human rights. So you can see that one of the core values of humanity was used for our public diplomacy's sake.
두 교수님께
And these two professors, researchers,
이 프레임
looked into how we can enable this value diplomacy. It's true that
경쟁 속에서
it has to survive the competition to have the value lay root.
그 현실적
And
연구를 해주셨습니다.
this project was taking a very realistic view on how to implement upon this. There is a value framework that's put together by many of those that are working on public diplomacy, but it's true that we need decades of work to have this lay its roots. But you can see that for us, in a relatively short period of time, the reason why we were able to engage in value diplomacy, it was because we actually had the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. We had this event that has made us make inroads into value diplomacy. So once again, thank you very much for our speaker and also Professor Cho. So a big round of applause for Ms. Ryu Taekyeong and her presentation. These are all new attempts.
여러분이 이해
So the next presentation, I think, will be relatively easier to understand, which has to do with the PyeongChang Peace Spirit and sports public diplomacy. So Professor Giwoong will be giving the presentation. You're not an athlete, are you? But you've actually, you are leading the HK project on diplomacy, and he is a very well-known person in legal affairs as well as arbitration. So I would like to ask his presentation to focus on how we can achieve public diplomacy through sports. Thank you very much. I am Jeong, HK professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. And Professor Lee asked me whether I was an athlete. Well, actually, until middle school, I was an athlete. I've actually took part in national championship events, but right now it was actually tennis, but now I just pursue tennis as a hobby. Today, I would like to talk about PyeongChang Peace Spirit and sports public diplomacy. I would like to extend my gratitude to PyeongChang and the mayor of PyeongChang for enabling this opportunity, as well as Professor Lee. Because of COVID, whenever we hold academic conferences, it's typical to just have experts gather together. And because we are all on the same page, it really did not strain me in giving my presentations. However, because we do have a diverse audience, I wasn't exactly sure what angle to take, but I wanted to keep this in perspective to better the understanding of a diverse group of people here in the floor. So that was how I prepared for my presentation. And you can see that I'm a part of a national task force, and what we focus on is on national strategies. So it's about providing the right atmosphere for unification, to transcend barriers, and also put together the right cultural hub to make all of this happen. So it's a very long name for a task force, but what we need to do in order to achieve an atmosphere for unification is to make sure that we don't base this off on not hard power, but on soft power, on culture. And that will enable us to usher in unification. And when we consider that, the PyeongChang Peace Spirit, I think, can play a significant role. My presentation will be in this order. I would like to talk about how sports can be used in diplomatic efforts and what sports public diplomacy is all about. And then I'll move on to talk about the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, about the Pyeongchang Peace Spirit, how that was originated, and also on how this Pyeongchang Peace Spirit can be utilized in sports public diplomacy. And last but not least, I would like to talk about the relationship between the peace and unification of Korean Peninsula as well as Pyeongchang's peace spirit. If we talk about sports public diplomacy, I think we all have different views on this. The media would criticize that we do not have enough prowess in sports diplomacy, but the sports diplomacy there, and when we say sports public diplomacy, the sports diplomacy there is also quite different. And there's also another type of concept for sports diplomacy. You can see that in the middle we have sports diplomacy, and this can be classified into 3 areas. In the media, when they talk about sports diplomacy, typically they will be talking about diplomacy within a sport. And another branch would be with diplomacy by achieving sports goals. So by hosting successfully an Olympic event would be one way to do this. So that's diplomacy for sport. And another type of diplomacy, if we take a diplomatic view, what we want to do is engage in diplomacy through a sport. So it's about utilizing sports as a tool for diplomacy. And this, of course, is what sports public diplomacy is all about. This includes how we can utilize sports diplomacy, and I think that the most often used type of concept is expanding upon the image. So in other words, by utilizing sports to raise the image or the prominence of a nation. And for any international action that a country may be for or may object would be to indirectly pose their position on a specific agenda item. If you look at the Beijing Olympics, many Western countries actually boycotted the Beijing Olympics, which was one way to pose their position or their stance in a particular political matter. And sports diplomacy can also help improve relationships. So for any deadlock, any stalemate relationships, sports can be utilized as a tool to better the relations. But in the case of promoting the image of a nation, does sports always make this happen? In other words, let's say that we've had some excellent results from an event or a sporting event. Would that actually help us raise the prominence of a country? Well, we'll have to think about that. And in addition to that, it's true that the country will focus on improving their results, and they may think that they've actually improved their image, that the image that other countries have. But would that really be correct? So I don't think I can name a specific sporting event, but it's up to your imagination. But let's say that in opening ceremony, let's say that if you try to say that you are stellar versus other countries, and if this home bias actually came into play where you eventually won more medals than others, can we still say that this would be viewed as better prominence or improved prominence by another third country? So if you think about sports diplomacy and its mechanism, there is a specific plan that should be in place, or a foreign policy in place, and sports would be used for us to achieve a national goal. So that's how it works. In Korea, the public diplomacy strategy can be divided into 3 areas. First is culture, second is knowledge, and third is policy. And sports diplomacy falls under the culture category. There are 9 agenda items here. And you can see that the category in bold that indicates sports diplomacy and the promotion of Taekwondo. So you can see that sports diplomacy actually falls under this bucket, under the culture domain. You may think that it takes on a very small portion in culture, but because of the productive effect or impact of sports, it actually plays a greater role. So let me now move on to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and how this Pyeongchang Peace Spirit was established. As you are very well aware, In 2018, we've seen a unified team of the two Koreas at Pyeongchang, but of course it was easier said than done. There was a painful process that was involved. So the first person that that argued for a joint host was Son Hak-kyu, the then representative of the Democratic Party, that argued the necessity of a joint hosting. And typically when we actually announce something like this, North Korea would respond, but there was no response coming from North Korea. And with regard to the statement by Mr. Son, there was some debate between the ruling and the opposition party, but then it just weighed down. But then in 2017, in Muju of North Jeolla Province, there was the World Taekwondo Championships. And at that time, President Moon Jae-in took part in this event. And there, the IOC member of DPRK was very pessimistic on what President Moon has mentioned. And what he said was that politics have to move in order to achieve this. So what happened? In 2018, at his New Year's address, Chairman Kim Jong-un mentioned that they would be taking part in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, and all of a sudden, we've seen a swift progress where we had the high-level inter-Korean summit held in Panmunjom, and the Olympics took place with the unified team, and we also have our athlete Cho Susie here. And I'm sure that you all remember that in 2018, the clock in the Korean Peninsula actually moved in a very dynamic fashion. We had the Inter-Korean Summits, the USDPRK Summit, and in September of 2018, at the Inter-Korea Summit in North Korea, they pledged to jointly host the Summer Olympics. But unfortunately, as you're very well aware, with the impasse and the Hanoi big deal, we've been seeing a stalemate between the two Koreas. And if we do win the bid of the 2032 to host the Summer Olympics in 2032, the Olympic line that we'll be using was beyond the line toward the future. But unfortunately, this was in vain. And I believe that the PyeongChang Peace spirit will have to be utilized when we do attempt to win the bid in the future, the bid for future Olympic events or future sporting events. So then, how can the PyeongChang Peace spirit be utilized in sports public diplomacy? In order to understand this, you first need to go into the evolution of the Olympics. So I divided up the phases into 5. So this is my classification. So first, with the modern Olympics, it was established in phase 1. So there wasn't a lot of interest. There was a lot of financial difficulties for the Olympics to be held. But then moving on during the Cold War phase, you can see that we've been seeing a sports competition amongst countries, and in 1960 to 1984, this was probably a challenging phase, which involved all sorts of challenges, including racism, terrorism, economic difficulties, as well as political boycotts. So there was a lot of skepticism as to whether the Olympics should carry on. But then, in 1988, the Seoul Olympics actually brought an end to the Cold War. So from the 1988 to 1996, I believe that in the history of the Olympics, it was probably when it was at its peak. But then we had the IOC Salt Lake scandal in 2000. So we really need to create a new Olympic spirit. So I think that we're seeing still reform ongoing for this Olympic event. And interestingly enough, 3 countries in East Asia hosted the Olympic Games. We had Japan, Korea, and China. I think I don't have a lot of time, so I will just skip these slides. And what I wanted to show to you using this diagram was so that by hosting the Olympics, 3 countries of Northeast Asia had specific goals that they wanted to attain. If you look at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, for instance, it was about improving relations with North Korea to create a peace atmosphere and also trigger further collaboration and cooperation, and also find a way to promote and disseminate this idea of peace in Korean culture around the world. So that was the cultural aspect that was embedded in our Olympic Games. If you look at the various sports public diplomacy programs, I would like to mention that the Pyeongchang Dream program was probably and is probably the most effective. It's still ongoing, but due to COVID-19, it's true that we cannot visit or have the youth of the warmer countries come to Pyeongchang and enjoy these winter sports. But we will be continuing on with this dream program so that we can hand down and continue to stimulate this Pyeongchang peace spirit. So for a peaceful unification, how can we utilize the spirit of peace of Pyeongchang? Last year was 2021, along with Kinu. I actually involved myself in a survey project on a peaceful unification. What the values that we pursued up till now was about combining unification diplomacy and public diplomacy together. But the issue here was that when it comes to the unification of the Korean Peninsula, it's true that we take this for granted. And we do know that it is a goal that must be achieved, but other countries may have a different view on this. They would say that, okay, we're fine with your unification of the Korean Peninsula, but what would be the benefits for us? So these are some of the questions that are posed. And in addition to that, if you meet with a foreign official, for instance, what would happen is they would ask, if they ask you, why do you need to unify? Why do the two Koreas have to be unified? If they ask that question to us, what would be your answer? I think that you should give some good thought to that as well. So for the unification of the Korean Peninsula, we need the efforts of the two Koreas, of course, but we also need the support of the international community. And in order to make this possible, of course, it's important to once again persuade or convince the justification behind unification to our neighboring stakeholders and find a way to elicit their support. The Korean government has a goal for unification. You can see that in 2010, the Korean government focused on public diplomacy. It's probably the first year of public diplomacy. We have now public diplomacy ambassador, established a public foreign policy division, and we also have a public diplomacy act. And there was the first plan for public diplomacy, and it was extended by 1 year to December 2022. So was it successful or not? I think that it depends. But I can say that it's important to find a sustainable method to form a consensus with the international community on this and on this vision of unification. And one way to do that, I think, would be the Pyeongchang peace spirit. And these attempts is not to actually replace peace with unification. What we want to do is find a way to utilize peace public diplomacy to fill the gaps. For instance, this concept of peace is a value of humanity, so we want to utilize that to better the understanding and also encourage the support of the international community for our unification. And I think that sports diplomacy and the spirit of peace in Pyeongchang will help us induce and encourage the participation of all of the people. So with that, let me conclude. Thank you very much.
네, 정기훈 교수님 감사드립니다.
Yes, Professor Jung, thank you very much for your presentation.
올림픽이라는 스포츠를 통해서
So through the Olympic event, we are trying to engage in sports diplomacy, whether it be diplomacy with sports or diplomacy through sports. And I think that it will be mentioned during the panel discussion, but this Inter-Korean Unified Team,
구성하고 있는
what are the implications?
치열한 경쟁
You can see that there's fierce competition, and there's also a level playing field that would be involved in a sporting event. And These are the critical pillars of the modern sports, but you can see that what happened was it wasn't about fierce competition, but it was about peace and harmony to bring these two teams together under one umbrella. So I think that this type of approach or concept or model is quite novice
그런 의미에서
in sports public diplomacy.
지금 코로나19로 인해서
And due to COVID-19,
우리가
as mentioned, we're meeting online, but you can see that it actually improves accessibility, so everybody knows what's happening on the other side of the world. So this may be a part of achieving our national interests, but I think that it's important to make sure that we also contribute to the international community if we really want to become a developed country. Many Asian countries were quite successful economically speaking, but we do see that there were struggles for democracy, or there are cases where there are a lot of human rights infringement. And if that is the case, we cannot say that we're a true developed nation. We do need development on all fronts of economy, politics, as well as society. But if that's not the case, we cannot say that we're a developed nation. So I believe that value diplomacy actually opens the door for us to become an advanced nation. So we were able to confirm that through Professor Jung's presentation. And let us now move on to the next presentation.
그 ODA 영역
We're now going to switch our focus to ODA or Overseas Development Assistance.
후발국가지만
Because when it comes to ODA, Korea was latecomer, but we really worked very quickly and we're working very rapidly to catch up. And I think that we can tie that in with the spirit of peace here in Pyeongchang, together with Peace ODA. So this is not going to be an easy challenge, but Professor Moon Kyungyon is going to provide a presentation in this regard. Professor Moon is in the UK right now. However, he has sent us his
교수님은 전북
presentation by video. He is currently a humanities professor at Jeonbuk National University, looking at food security and food assistance.
김경연 교수님의
Would now like to hear from Professor Moon now.
예, 안 계시지만 박수를
He is not here to hear this, but please give him a big round of applause. Hello.
평창 평화정신과 평화 OD라는 주제.
I am very pleased to have this presentation here at the PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022, Peace Here and Now, and the spirits of peace and public diplomacy. My name is Moon Kyungyon. I'm a professor at Jeonbuk National University. I ask you for your understanding that I could not attend in person. I'm going to go through my presentation for about 15 minutes or so. I'm going to share my screen with you.
네, 오늘 발표 주제는
Today I would like to talk about the HDP nexus, the nexus between humanitarianism, development, and peace.
국제사회가 강조하고 있는 이 HDP 넥서스는 무엇인지
I want to go over the HDP nexus that the international community is emphasizing. And from this point of view, I would like to look at the dilemma in the peace issue of the Korean Peninsula and also perhaps provide you with a new approach for peace building on the Korean Peninsula.
그리고 남북한 평화협력 공식의 모멘텀으로서
Also, I would like to touch upon SDGs as a possible momentum for the exploration of inter-Korean peace cooperation. I know that we've been talking about SDGs internationally for a very long time, but I would like to take a look at how SDGs can be a possibility, an alternative for us as well.
인도주의 지원과
The international community has been looking at humanitarianism, development, and peace. So in the past, they have looked at this separately, as separate approaches, but now they're trying to look at this as an integrated approach. They're trying to look at them all together as a nexus. And the international community have come upon the realization that this is very important to integrate these together. Many actors and international organizations are now looking at development, peace building from this sort of nexus approach. This is a recommendation that they have been making. HDP stands for Humanitarian Development and Peace. The first initials, HDP. The HDP nexus was introduced because over the past 50 years, the world has engaged in various different kinds of development assistance, different kinds of humanitarian assistance, and peace-building activities, but we've seen that the outcome was not as successful as we might like.
또 세계은행에서도
The World Bank as well also
접근의
said that
필요성을 인식을 하고
there is a need for an integrated approach.
750억 달러의 지원
And the World Bank also announced its largest funding
2019년
pledge to date, about $75 billion.
OECD
The OECD DAC high-level meeting has also adopted a recommendation on the HDP nexus.
단순히 특정 기관의 이니셔티브가 아닌 국제사회
So we can see here that this is not just an initiative by a single organization out there, that this is actually what the international community is all rallying around together.
따라서 그 HD 넥서스는 내용적인 측면에서
Therefore, the HDP nexus, if we look at what it means, is that humanitarian assistance, development, and peace should be connected organically, which they are, and that we have to integrate them together for as a joint objective.
새로운 분쟁에 대처할 수
With humanitarian assistance, it could be seen as a preemptive, a kind of precondition for development, and in that regard, humanitarian assistance can be provided
환경 기반
so that the country or the nation can build their capacity to respond to new conflicts and disputes, and development assistance can provide a very necessary base for peace, and peace would also allow for sustainable development to happen. This means that humanitarian assistance is a necessary precondition for peace building,
개발을 위한
and peace building activities
환경이다라고 얘기할 수 있는 것이죠.
are meant to be done in a way that humanitarian crises would not occur again. Therefore, for sustainable development and a permanent solution, development assistance and development cooperation and peace building have to be integrated together, and this is the thrust of the HDP nexus.
그 그래프가
The graph that you see
인도적 지원,
is on development cooperation, humanitarian assistance, and peace building. So it's a diagram of sorts that is looking at how these 3 points are aligned, and I would like to share my screen with you again so you can see.
인도적 지원에서 시작을 해볼까요? 인도적 지원은 생명보호 및
For example, if we were to start with humanitarian assistance, there is saving of lives and rescue activities, disaster reduction, protect civilians for armed conflict and natural disaster, and satisfy the basic needs of people, and emergency relief. Now, this is a very basic kind of support and assistance that we can provide.
적인 평화, 적극적인 평화 유지하는데 가장
And this would be a way for us to allow for positive peace, a very active sort of positive peace to establish itself. In development cooperation, there is the objective to decrease hardship, such as poverty and vulnerability, and also prevent and manage the outcomes of vulnerability, disputes, conflict, disaster, and also to try to strengthen the rule of law, democratic participation in human rights, and sustainable development. And this is something that could allow for more sustainable development to happen.
따로 떼기가
All of these different 3 nexus points do not function separately, but that they should be done in an integrated manner, along with peace building, as you can see, because this would allow for a permanent peace building, the prevention of new conflicts, and the ending of armed conflict, positive peace, and a rebuilding of the state.
다양한 또 이론들이 있는데
There are many different theories regarding this.
인권에 어떻게 영향을 미치느냐에 대한 이론적
I want to touch upon a theoretical discussion that has occurred recently on how development impacts human rights. Neil Mitchell has said that economic development
경제 수준이 높을수록
can lead to political stability, which could then improve human rights situation. So the higher the economic levels, the higher the levels of human rights protection. William Easterly has said that economic development can promote human rights, but not always. It's not always the case. In fact, in some cases, economic development
상황을 악화시킬 수도 있다.
can hurt human rights situations. So it's a reverse U kind of relationship between the two, economic development and human rights. Early on in economic development, there are ways done to exploit human labor.
경제 발전의 초기 단계에서
So early on in the economic development stage, there are instances where human rights are violated and abused. So there needs to be some kind of institutional system in place. Samuel P. Huntington
경제 발전이
has argued that economic development does not always equate to human rights promotion. Human rights are promoted by socio-cultural factors and the values of the elite and external influences. So it would depend on the kind of culture that the country has, the ruling elites, their values. So this would mean politicians and leaders of society,
지도자, 경제
so economic leaders, so corporations, CEOs, well, the kinds of values that they have and the surrounding environments of that state.
코네이 핸더스 같은 경우는
Conway Henderson has said that
성공하더라도 인권은
even if a country succeeds in economic development, human rights can proceed in a very slow fashion. Political elites
경제 발전
are responsible for slow progress made on economic growth and make it very asymmetrical.
그 통치 엘리트들이 어떤 사고
It would depend on the mindset of the ruling elites,
인권이 인권 상황이 이제 다르게
depending on what they think and the kind of policies they pursue, that the economic growth and economic development
일반적으로
could occur in a way that could even harm
대도국이 이제 그
human rights. So, for example, we know of many developing nations that are resource rich, but the resource typically is very limited, and so they would try to extract these resources and in the process bring in the military, and in that process the military elites would rise to power, and the military elites would find it in their interest to
이제 폴리와
hold on to their wealth and hold on to the oppression of human rights.
같은 경우는 저소득
And if we move on, we say that Paul Collier, in another case, has said that low incomes and
라고
the possibility of a possible civil war are positively correlated.
있을 때 발생
When there is low levels of development, this leads to conflict and tension, and this conflict then leads to further levels of poverty. John Barnett has said that low incomes does not always lead to war.
기회 부족이 묻다라고 얘기를
Conflict
발전
exists because there is a lack of opportunity for development.
그렇지 못한
And
그 부류 계층 간의 어떤 힘의 균형이
when there is
고리
a break in the balance of power
꼭 저소득 상태에 있다고 해서
among the wealth of society, this is when conflict arises in that society. Eric Gartz has said that economic growth through capitalism can lead to international prosperity and peace and stronger levels of peace.
제도 규범
The market will function in a way to lessen the possibility of disputes and conflict. Because when there is a dispute or conflict simmering in the surface, then the markets would react to this. And he has argued that democratic countries do not engage each other in war because they know that the markets would respond and they have an interest in trying to protect the interests of the markets.
체제를 가진 이 나라
However, countries with different systems and countries that are not capitalist or do not have a market economy that is functioning would respond differently.
그 이러한 이론적 논의를 바탕으로 한반도의 평화
Based on these theoretical discussions, we would like to take a look at the dilemma on the issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula. And we know that the situation is very difficult indeed. As we know, there are international sanctions that are still quite severe,
빈곤과 기아
and there is widespread poverty and starvation. The economic difficulties are leading to a sustained humanitarian crisis, and this has also been compounded by COVID-19.
통제를 하면서
The residents are not allowed to move about freely.
그나마 이제 붕괴된 국가 배급 체계를
The ration system in the DPRK has also collapsed,
못하게 되는 상황이 되면서
And as you know, the ration system, when it doesn't work, typically the DPRK residents would turn to a kind of black market. So they would turn to their Changmadang and their different markets. But that is no longer the case under COVID-19. So this is similar to the 1990s during the Arduous March, when there were millions of people who died of starvation.
인도적 상황, 인권 상황이 아직까지
And in this current situation, the human rights violations of the DPRK people
이런 딜레마를
are ongoing.
어떻게 볼 것이냐?
Now, there are these dilemmas, as you can see,
이동진
but
박사
how should we approach this dilemma on the Korean Peninsula? In the case of Kim Dong-jin, he has said that
을 적극적으로 좀 스터디할 필요가 있다. 적용하는 것은
we have to look at the HDP nexus and possibly explore any applications of the HDP nexus to Korean Peninsula,
이라든지
particularly when it comes to development cooperation. So when we engage in policies for development cooperation,
그래서 평화 환경, 평화
we should try to
개발 협력을 통해
see how, through development cooperation, we can contribute to peace building.
평화 영역에 있어서 평화 굴축
And in areas of peace,
그 관여하는 주요 그 스테이크홀더들 이해관계자들은 단순
all of the stakeholders who participate in this process should not look at just one issue, one separate issue, but look at all of these different issues together. So humanitarian assistance for the DPRK, development, and also human rights situations. So the stakeholders also have to take a very integrated approach, a kind of holistic approach,
센서티브라는 표현이
a kind of a conflict-sensitive approach, if you will.
평화의 영역에 있는 그 행위자들 또한
The actors who are working on peace building should not just look at peace or denuclearization, but these actors should also try to work on ways to tie in efforts towards peace with development and human rights.
또 이를 위해서 선 비핵화 후 저희가 가지고 있는 문제의식은
So in that regard,
선 비핵화 후에 지원 및
many people in Korea have said that denuclearization has to come first before we can have support or exchange.
코치를 통한 평화 뭐 이런 것들
And so instead of that kind of linear approach, many people have said that we should have socio-cultural sports exchange and humanitarian and development assistance cooperation and through this we can have peace building.
어떻게 평화를 구축하는데 기여할 수 있을
But we have to look at ways on how development and humanitarian assistance can be done in a way to assist efforts for peace.
남북 간의 대립이 긴장이
There was a lot of tension in the 2017 run-up to the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympics, but the Winter Olympics then eased the tension, and this led to a mood of dialogue, and the next few years in 2018 brought about a huge atmosphere for peace for the Korean Peninsula.
그때 이후에 사회 문화 교류 인도적 개발 지원을 하자가 아니라
So as you can see here, it's not about a linear process. It's not there is a sequence of one would lead to two and two would lead to three, but that we have to take an integrated approach, inclusive of sports and cultural exchange and etc. And this could ultimately become a means to allow for peace and further on to unification.
우리의 딜레마는 이런 것
In the past, our dilemma was that
평화 구축에
development assistance
기여하고 있고 많은 이론들이 그렇게 얘기를 합니다.
could lead to peace, and there are many theories that argue this.
평화 구축 즉
And then there are also theories that say that peace, once it is built, even without development assistance, that peace building activities can lead to an establishment of peace. However, the problem here is that there is that issue of sustainability,
못하는 그런
because if either one of these approaches is taken separately and pursued separately, then the peace, even if it comes about, would not be sustainable.
정착을
And so we have to try to look at how North Korea assistance and exchange and cooperation
같습니다.
can assist peace building and peace settlement processes.
그 논문에서 제가 차용을 해서 한번 적용.
This diagram has also been lifted from Dr. Kim Dong-jin's paper, and here we can see that he has argued that there are these response areas, and then this would lead to challenges for peace building and all these different areas that we can possibly think about engaging in activities in.
교류를 함에 있어서 인터랙션을 함에 있어서
And in engaging in exchange here,
그래서 이제 그 보자면 그러니까 국가 간의 관계, 국제 사회 영역에서는
in international society,
뭐 동계 올림픽과 같은 그런 국가 간 행사들에
these state-to-state activities, so country activities such as Olympic Games, which are attended by nation states, so we have to continue to try to engage DPRK in those
유치를 추진하고 있는데 이런
nation-state games. And we also know that DPRK is also trying to participate in many different kinds of international activities, so we should try to assist them and respond positively to that. Even if the outcome might not always be favorable or successful, then we have to continue to try to engage DPRK in many different ways, very actively. And this could be done by private sector actors, civil society, corporations, and even foundations like the PyeongChang Peace Foundation, that these civilian and private sector organizations to try to look at different ways to identify all of these different ways and try to uphold the values of democracy, environmental protection, human rights,
궁극적으로 한번 더 평화 가능하지
and
않은 게
equality of the sexes. And this would be a way for us to try to ultimately lead to the stage of peace.
그 교류 협력을 활성화할 수 있는 계기가 있느냐? 북한이
We can wonder whether there are some opportunities for us to see a momentum for exploration of inter-Korean peace cooperation. And one of these momentums could come in the form of SDGs, because as you know, North Korea has set forth a UN Strategic Plan 2017 to 2021. In fact, it has worked together with international organizations in 2016 to say this. I also did similar work in the past to try to look at what we can do with UNESCO to try to engage with the DPRK in the areas of SDGs, and there was an area regarding sports.
계획상에 있는 순임의 세부
So under sports, there are these different specific categories.
즉 국제 표준 기술 표준을 적용하기 위한 북한의 역량 강화.
So for example, with data and development management, there are ways of building DPRK capacity to apply international technological standards, for example, and also to try to have a reporting mechanism become more reinforced in DPRK for international treaties and convention of other systems. And also capacity building for the DPRK for UNESCO's various sports level activities, such as at the CIGEPS and the International Sports Anti-Doping Convention, for example.
즉 인도주의 개발 평화를
As a way of conclusion, I wanted to say that it would be helpful for us to pursue an integrated HDP nexus to look at DPRK. And we must do this.
인도적 문제, 인도적 지원 문제, 개발 문제에 대한
And through this, we can look at the issues of humanitarianism and development and human rights and the DPRK. And this would lead us to these kinds of conclusions. The Pyeongchang Winter Olympics
심각한 그 수준으로
became a momentum for us to try to build peace through dialogue in a situation that was really at the time almost on the brink of war, possibly the most serious situation after the Korean War.
정상회담이 지속되는
Since then, we've had the Inter-Korean Summit and the USDPRK Summit,
인도감을
and we have felt, all of us, a sense of psychological relief.
이득을 유지
However, on the contrary, the DPRK regime and the residents were not able to benefit from this at all because the sanctions were not lifted, their humanitarian situation continued to worsen, and the economic situation continued to worsen. And then there was COVID-19. COVID-19 has really shattered the DPRK economy to the situation of the 1990s, when there were about 300,000 people who died of starvation and millions more went hungry.
발전하여 지속
However, the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics was a momentum to try to bring DPRK to the dialogue table,
자원이 아닌
and this momentum
시민 사회문화 교류는
should have been sustained. However, that was not done, and the reason for that is because of the Republic of Korea and international society.
상황을 위한
The two Koreas in sports and socio-cultural exchange can allow for the DPRK to come to the dialogue table, but we have to evolve this to try to lead to various different positive values and positive outcomes. There needs to be sustained and additional efforts to build on this momentum. The international society is also stressing the importance of HDP nexus, and so the DPRK is also saying that they are willing to implement the SDGs. However, in implementing this very ideal approach, the South Korean society, international society, and DPRK also have to engage in additional efforts. So there needs to be more efforts done in this regard. Thank you for your attention.
네, 문경현 교수님
Thank you very much, Professor Moon, for your presentation. He was in the UK, so he was not able to join us physically in person, but he was trying to say that peace ODA and peace, the spirit of peace in Pyeongchang, if we were to try to align them together, that we have to come up with a lot of different efforts and approaches. So we're sorry that we had to give more time to Professor Moon.
So sports, public diplomacy, and ODA, and value diplomacy under this peace framework. These are three sectors of public diplomacy, and we would like to go into this further with our panelists. I know that we have also panelists on Zoom, so I would like to first thank Professor Kim Tae-kyun for his input. He's currently professor at Seoul National University Graduate School of International Studies, and he's has also been the non-standing director for the ODA committee, and I know that he has a lot of insights from the academia and also on the field, and also with regard to policy, so he plays a multifaceted role. And regarding this new approach, I believe that he will be offering us with some good words of advice. So Professor Kim Tae-kyun, you have the floor. A big round of applause, please. Hello, everyone. As introduced, I'm Kim Tae-kyun from Seoul National University. I know that we are behind schedule, so I would like to be brief as possible. I did not know that I was going to be the first panelist, so I'm a bit baffled. But at any rate, I can see that Dr. Jinho has actually provided many slides, and I think some of the areas may be redundant, so I would like to save my time for former Vice President Jinho. Thank you very much for all of the three presentations, and if I may give my comments as a whole for all of our three speakers, it's that we need universal public diplomacy for peace. So in other words, there's also universality and specificity that always go together. And for the peace on Korean Peninsula, when it comes to peace, it has to be universal. The current administration was particularly focused on that. We talk about universal values of peace, that's most important. But if you look at the initiatives and policies of the administration, it involves peace in Korea, on Korean Peninsula, and also unification. So what happens is the international community agrees, but to encourage them for their support, I think was not the case. So I think that we need to work further on that. So we need long-term investments in the universality of this agenda about what peace is all about for Korea, and that it actually connects to international norms, whether it be SDGs. So we need to continue on to invest our efforts to emphasize the universality, and only then can we actually make our sports diplomacy or any public diplomacy more convincing. If you look at neighboring countries, including Japan and China, it's true that they have been continuing on the theory of national development, and I think that it's also the case for Korea. In other words, it's a development-focused type of national growth, that economic growth is important, and relatively speaking, human rights or any universal values of peace in the international community was not that emphasized in Northeast Asia. It really did not receive the limelight. So I think that the role of Korea will be significant, whether it be an integrated approach or an HDP nexus. But I personally believe that Korea needs to bring together a model to set forth the principles for public diplomacy. And based on this principle, go into some specific activities, whether it be sport or any domain. So we really need to take a systematic approach. It could be the public diplomacy 2.0, but at any rate, we really need to invest our efforts in the universality. And I think that Korea can maybe become some sort of play the role of a Northern Europe country in Northeast Asia, and I think such an approach would be necessary. And regardless of whichever administration would take office going forward, we need to take this approach for Korea to be successful. And if I may also add another layer to this discourse, the HDP nexus, it was mentioned by Professor Moon, and he's not here today, so I will be delivering my comments to him separately. And I know that Dr. Song will be talking about ODA, so what I want to say is HDP Nexus considers three areas: development, peace, and humanitarianism. And if you look at the discussions up till now, we have mentioned that the three values go together and that they're all complementary, and that was basically it. But I believe that we have to go one step further. If Korea wants to continue on to utilize HDP Nexus as a policy or a strategy, we really need to mention which has the priority. In other words, we need to set the priority amongst these three values, and I think that it should be peace, and the remaining two will be playing a supporting role. So I think that we really need to define the linkage amongst these three values. And thank you very much for the presentation on the Korean Peninsula and peace on Korean Peninsula and public diplomacy. But I would like to pose a question to all of the three speakers, which would be, I can see that you all end at a positive note, and you also talk about the direction, the desirable direction forward. So yes, I do support all of your approaches, and I accept your proposals. But the common question that I have for you all is that we may be needing some recollection. So what I mean by this is that if there were some room for improvement for sports public diplomacy, what were the hurdles? So in pursuing value diplomacy, what are the hindrances? And what are the areas that we should recollect upon and improve? And that was a question that I wanted to also pose with regard to peace ODA, but he's not here. But as will be presented by Mr. Song, strategic peace, sustainable peace, there are a lot of concepts and a lot of discussions underway. So I believe that these normative dialogue and discourse, we would like to understand how much that is reflected in the discourse in Korea. And if we do not see that link, our stance will only be hollow, and it will be very difficult to align ourselves with international norms. So what I want to say is that we really need experts to come together and muster their wisdom. And it's not just a value that would be specific to Korea. We really need to find a way to link the universal values to make it a public agenda in the international world, to have it reflected on the agenda of the international community. And if that's the case, I believe that, as we can see, Sweden and Norway, they're very convincing in the international community. Korea can actually play a similar role in this very overarching framework, so whether it be ODA or sports. So actually, I would like to share more, but in lieu of time, let me close here, and thank you very much for your attention. Yes, Professor Kim, thank you very much for that very succinct comments. Thank you so much for giving us that big picture.
여러 가지 논의가
I believe that it's important to make sure that we really need to have universality well aligned with the specificity of the agenda that we have. And if we can't do that, it will just remain hollow. So he's mentioned that it's important to make sure that we need to institutionalize the universal values in our agenda and in our approach for our public diplomacy strategy to be successful, and also encourage support of the international community on this agenda for the Korean Peninsula. And in addition to that, he's mentioned that the Nordic countries are very well known for their public diplomacy efforts. In Sweden, they're known for gender equality, and if you see the case of Norway, they have leadership in climate response. And you can see that these Nordic countries all do have the center, the core, a core role that they play, and they expand upon their core in their public diplomacy. As you know, Norway, through the Nobel Prize, has been focusing on public diplomacy on peace. And if you look at Korea,
적인 무게중심이
it's true that maybe the center of gravity for us should be peace in our public diplomacy efforts. So that was what Professor Kim was saying. And you can see that public diplomacy has many faces. And it's true that there may be a competition for what should be the core, whether it be democracy or whether it should be human rights. So I think that right now the discourse is about that competition amongst these very different values, but he's mentioned that we really need to find a way to find the core and make it universal. And would it be okay for me to invite our next speaker that's online via Zoom? I would like to invite President Kim. Since he is online. And it's true that Professor Moon actually took on a lot of time, so the organizers actually gave us some additional time to continue on with our panel discussion. So let me first invite our online participant, Professor Kim. He's currently in self-quarantine, so he wasn't able to take part today in person. At any rate, Professor Kim, thank you for joining us. And he will be talking about public diplomacy and public cooperation. He's actually leading an association on international development cooperation. He's a well-known public advisor, also plays a leading role in this domain. So once again, President Kim, your words please. A big round of applause. Hello everyone. As introduced, I am Kim Sunggyu, President of Korea Association of International Development and Cooperation. I really wanted to join you offline, but I do ask for your understanding due to my circumstances. Professor Lee and Dr. Song, it's a great pleasure to see you, although it's online. And thank you all to the speakers and panelists, and it's an honor for me to join you. Once again, due to time constraints, I do want to just briefly comment on Professor Moon's presentation. The HDP Nexus concept is not a new concept. But regardless, the reason why this concept is receiving the spotlight, there are a couple of reasons behind that. I think it all evolves from the vulnerabilities of the international community. We're seeing a lot of conflicts, and we're seeing these structural difficulties in the international community. In order to overcome or solve these challenges, it's true that we really need a comparative advantage in humanitarianism, development, and peace to complement the gaps that exist. So then, in actual initiatives and projects, as mentioned, it's about the methodology. So rather than elaborating on the concept or the theory, I think that HDP Nexus really needs to find a way to be applied. So whether it be financing or how to implement, I think that it's about understanding the know-how to implement. So I think there's a lot of discussions on that right now. And with regard to non-voluntary movement, we've been researching this quite extensively, but it's important to understand the cause. So especially putting this under the peace framework. And as you know, we're seeing this protracted issue of refugees. So the refugees, on average, will have to live in another country for 26 years, they say. And until 2030, OECD forecasts that we'll be seeing the extreme poverty that will become future refugees. And against this backdrop, it's important to see this and refer to this HDP Nexus approach. You can see that this is about what's actually happening on the field. It's about development assistance, and all of this is centered on the vulnerabilities that exist in the international community. I know that there's a lot of discourse on implementation, methodology, as well as monitoring indicators, but I think that it's about the link amongst these three values. And what we need to do is to make sure that these discussions will be more bottom-up than just focus on principle or theory. In other words, we need a lot of feedback from the field to better the process. And moving on, I would like to talk about peace. Why is peace important? In development cooperation, we talk about the importance of the role of peace building. So it's about providing the right environment for sustainable development, and peace building will be playing a key role in ushering in such an atmosphere. So peace building and providing the right environment for peace is now a key issue in development assistance. The HDP Nexus methodology, I think it's not something that works in sequence. For instance, it's not about having humanitarian aid come first, followed by development cooperation and peacekeeping. It's about making sure that these factors all come into play in a simultaneous fashion. So, it's true that we do need high-level professionalism as well as a collaborative culture, and we do see that the international community is particularly focused on these areas. So it's about making sure that these structural challenges can be integrated together when implementing the HDP Nexus. There are many examples, both in Korea as well as abroad, on HDP Nexus. I also know that there's another session on this, especially the cases of the CLMV countries. So I will not go into the examples, but moving on to development cooperation, the speakers have talked about this, but I would like to talk some more further on development and peace. If you think of economic growth, does this have a direct relationship with peace, human rights, and gender? Well, I cannot agree, because economic growth can be a necessity, but there are some of the power elites, the social and political elites that do have local power, and depending on their immaturity or an abuse of power, it can lead to social instability, refugee issues, and polarization. And a social system, a responsive social system, and the immaturity of the civil society can also accelerate this situation. And last but not least, on the Korean Peninsula, before I close, so in development cooperation, I mean, we're talking about the Korean Peninsula-based ODA, but if you look at the HDP Nexus, I think that it will carry meaning, but if you go into detailed implementation, what we're trying to do is, within the ODA frame, we're trying to offer development assistance to North Korea, but I think that it's a bit too limited. There are a lot of interests of the international community on the Korean Peninsula, so this is a specific aspect, and the political considerations and some of the diplomatic judgments have been excluded in the process. So what we were trying to do is reduce the tension and put in place a step-by-step peace process by utilizing other public diplomacy means such as sports. So I agree to that, but I think that we really need the right momentum to trigger the process, and that is what it's lacking. We've been talking about past cases, but right now we have to find that right trigger or momentum to kickstart this process. And in the aspect, the role of the local governments, the civil society, and the private sector is something that is all the more emphasized. And last but not least, on the SDGs for North Korea, North Korea adopted the UN strategic plan, and I think that this is something to note. Especially disasters, resilience, climate change, and the recovery of communities. You can see that there are a lot of challenges that we really need to focus on. And these are some of the areas that should be all the more emphasized for North Korea's strategic plan. And in the academia, we focus on standards, about standardization and introducing these standards. So we're trying to really focus on the contents in these development cooperation package, and I think that we need some further discussion on these topics. I do not have any questions, but I do want to say that peace, public diplomacy, and value diplomacy, all of these aspects at the end of the day needs to find the right momentum in value diplomacy and in sports, and I think that we really need to come together to find the right impetus for all of these efforts. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for keeping to the time, and thank you very much for hitting all of the key points and also on the challenges that we may face when we implement the HDP Nexus. And you've also mentioned about the National Action Plan of North Korea regarding SDG, that we really need to find an integrated approach for North Korea as well. So thank you very much. We are to conclude at 11:50. And I would like to ask our panelists to be mindful of the time. So let me now move on to Susie.
Yes, can you tell us about your experiences as you were an athlete in the field? About the experiences of being in a sports public diplomacy in action. Please give Ms. Cho Suji a big round of applause.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 2018
Hello.
동계올림픽
I participated in the inter-Korean team at the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. My name is Cho Suji. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to be very quick.
저에게 이곳 평창은 굉장히 특별한 곳이에요.
Pyeongchang is a very special place for me.
올림픽이 생각이
Now
나요.
that I'm here, I'm reminded of the Olympics. So when I think of the Olympics, I think of the inter-Korean team.
북한 선수들과 함께 그렸던
And I think of how we were working towards peace with the DPRK athletes.
선생님들과 함께
The fact that I'm here with distinguished speakers in Pyeongchang is a great honor for me.
발표하신 평창 평화 정신과 스포츠
Professor Kyungyon talked about Pyeongchang spirit of peace and public diplomacy. It was very impactful to me, so I'd like to give you my own thoughts based on my experiences in 2018.
는 BTS 보유국이라고 할 정도로
Korea is known as a BTS nation.
활발한 문화 교류
It is seeing a lot of interest around the world, and there's a lot of cultural exchange that is being done. And sports is also a huge means of soft power, and Pyeongchang Olympics allow for that.
것처럼
Earlier on, as Professor Taekyeong said, the Pyeongchang Olympics brings together ICT, culture, sports, environment. It was seen as a very successful means of sports diplomacy around the world.
단일팀을 구성하는
The
과정
inter-Korean team,
좋지
when we comprised it, however, it was not an easy process. It was just 3 weeks left remaining before the Olympics. We heard that there was going to be an inter-Korean team. We didn't have a choice in the matter.
도구로서 이용되어
I didn't know why sports should be used as a political tool. I had no idea why it had to be done that way, because it was rushed. The process was arbitrary, and the inter-Korean team I didn't think would bring about peace. However, it was very surprising what happened. In a very short period of time, we became one team, and we were able to send a lasting message of
기본적인 취지는
peace around the world.
곧 평화의 수단이라고 했던가요?
They say Olympics is a means to peace. People now look at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics as a peace Olympics. And to be honest, before then, I was not very interested in North Korea at all.
깊이 공감.
And I didn't really think about the need for unification.
휴전국에 살지만
I live in a divided nation, but I thought that Korea is very peaceful. So I didn't really think about improving ties with North Korea or about enhancing national image or etc.
그렇게 특별한 시간을 경험한 후
However, after my own personal experiences, I was able to see the impact of sports diplomacy and the importance of peace.
팀원들을 볼 수 없다는 사실에
The fact that I can no longer see the athletes that I worked together with in the DPRK really made me feel that we are living in a divided nation. So I think that sports can build on our own mutual interests and allow for sustainable peace to take place, and that would be very helpful. The inter-Korean team was used as a tool for pursuit of national interests, but I think that it was also an example of national interest.
스포츠와 정치가 상호작용
There was no choice given to the athletes, but I hope that this can be improved, while still we can maintain our work on sports diplomacy.
적으로 끝난 평창 올림픽입니다.
The Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, although difficult, was successful. But was it successful internationally?
참여로 전 세계가
The DPRK participated and the world paid attention, but
중요한 아니었을까?
I think that perhaps the peace that came out of Pyeongchang was impactful only for us.
말씀하신 수용의 문제
Earlier on, Professor Jung talked about the issue
좋다고만
of acceptance, because if this was good for us and we're happy about it and we talk about it, that's just boasting.
생각하고
I think that the follow-up process is more important, and the message of peace should be something that is what the whole world works towards.
최고의 행운이자
The 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics is going to be very important.
2024 강원에서는
Another watershed moment for us.
팀으로 아이스하키 경기가 이루어지면 어떨까 합니다.
If perhaps we can have a mixed NOC team in ice hockey, that would be
다국적
helpful because we already have a lot of exchange with the DPRK team in terms of ice hockey.
경기를 하는 것입니다.
And this could be a way for us to also be like another inter-Korean team. And I'm proposing this because the 2024 Gangwon Games is being pursued right now with joint hosting in mind. So there could be mention of another inter-Korean team. However, if it's not a planned inter-Korean team, then the athletes would be sacrificed for political pursuit again, and the same problems could occur again.
특히나 2024 강원은
The 2024 Gangwon
청소년을 대상으로 하는 올림픽이
Games is for the youth, and these youth athletes want to later on become part of the Olympic team, so we don't want to take any opportunities away from them
될 것입니다.
or hurt them.
따라서 공동 개최에 있어
Therefore,
있는 여러 변수들을
we
고려하고
have to look at the different variables that could occur for joint hosting and prepare for them.
하면 북한의 참가 유무에 영향을
If it's a multi-NOC
모두가
team, then this could be a very significant games without hurting anyone in the process.
상상 때처럼 갑자기 참가
If the DPRK suddenly says that they want to participate in the games, all of a sudden, right before the games, they can participate in the multi-NOC team. So it doesn't impact or negatively hurt any of the ROK players. This could also be impactful for the global village as well, for the international society.
다국적 네트워크는
This kind of multinational NOC team would be something that would just not involve the two Koreas, but everyone around the world, where we can all support one another and go beyond the miracle of Pyeongchang and have a huge impact on the international society.
모든 선수들이 경쟁에
All of the athletes that come to Pyeongchang should not just think about competition,
기억을
but would take away with them the memory of peace.
청소년들이 그 한 번의 교류와 기억을 토대로
The youth
훗날 세계 무대의 주인공이 되어
would later become actors of
국가입니다.
peace around the international community, and they will become actors in the future. The winter sports is typically thought of as an elite sports arena only for advanced nations.
드림 프로그램
YPC Peacemakers' participation could be more helpful to spread the message that this is an inclusive Olympics, regardless of where you're from, that anyone can participate in.
청소년들이 손에
This means that youth athletes around the world can stand hand in hand and contribute to peace at 2024 in Gangwon.
Human rights no
They say human rights knows no boundaries.
마치겠습니다.
With that, I would like to also say that peace knows no season.
계절이 없다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
교수님
Thank you
감사드립니다.
very much, Ms. Cho Soo-ji,
경험을
for your
바탕으로
contribution. Based on your experiences in 2018, she has proposed a possible mixed NOC team. This is a very innovative proposal. So we'll now move on.
오늘 준비하신
I would now like to move on to former Vice President Jinho. I know that you have a lot of presentation materials ready, but I think that you can give us a very good lesson on how we can summarize that vast amount of data. He was the former Vice President of KOICA and in Ulsan and Busan. He was also the Secretary General of YMCA, and in the area of ODA, international cooperation, you can see that he was basically the person that has brought this and reflected this into policy, also the leader in terms of implementation. So it's a great pleasure to invite Mr. Song,
맡아주시.
and he's also the chair of the PyeongChang Peace Foundation. So you have the floor. A big round of applause, please.
11시 43분 제가
It is 11:43.
4분 5분 만에 PPT 42페이지
I have 42 pages. I'm going to go through them in 4 or 5 minutes. That's going to be a miracle. And I'm going to give 3 minutes to my colleague. I'm not going to go through the same thing over again, but when we talk about SDG, SDG 16, SDG 16 plus, and humanitarian assistance, ODA, and peace, how are they going to be aligned together? Humanitarian assistance, whether it be DPRK or South Sudan, we provide rice and wheat and etc. to them to allow for sustainable development. How is this tied in with peace? In the past, we looked at incrementalism. Let's give them food first, and then we can solve something else, and then go towards peace. But now we want to try to do this simultaneously. And Ph.D. for this means peace, human rights, and democracy. The HDP nexus is, I think, it's a kind of a rhetoric. It's a kind of slogan for UN.
그래서 하여튼 유엔에서도 Pathway for Peace라고
At the UN, there's a pathway for peace
또
and SDG 16 plus discussions as well. So there's a lot of a dilemma at the UN level as well. And they say that the peace agenda is now surfacing as a very important concept, and there is a lot of now experience in international society on peace and development. We always talk about how peace is for South Korea and North Korea, and there's peace for South Korea and Japan, and peace for South Korea and a third nation. But we have to also look at this integrated manner and a global approach, and I agree with that. And we have that experience overseas. We have that global experience. We can look at what UNDP has done. We can see what OECD has done and what the UN OHCHR has done. So that's why we can look at HDP nexus here, and there's the OECD DAG INCAF and the DAG INCAF work here with the nations that are fragile and in conflict situations. We have to build the capacity of civil society and women and youth. So there are these different 9 areas that we can think about. Specifically, the UN has a peace-building fund. We should look deeply into this fund because UN is trying to engage in a holistic approach in terms of their peace-building activities. The UNDP is also looking at democratic governance and peace-building projects. This is something that I really wanted to focus on. South Sudan also is a place where Korea has stationed its own Korean troops, the Hanbit base, the Hanbit troops. Here, similarly as to how we will be planting rice in the DMZ border, they're doing the same thing in South Sudan, trying to provide food assistance to the people in South Sudan, and they're trying to create a marketplace. I think they call it the Hanbit Marts, but they call it a marketplace here in South Sudan. So basically, you're creating a marketplace within a safe zone, and perhaps we can do something similar to this in the DMZ border region, create a market in the DMZ region, and this could be a way to foster peace in the future. I think that another important concept of HDP is that it could have an impact in the DMZ border region, that we can imagine something creative like this, because we've already done something like this in South Sudan. It is not just the Korean troops, but Sweden's SIDA project has also done something very similar. They've created a market in a safe zone. I am from KOICA. I used to work there, so I don't want to tout our activities, but there were all these different activities in KOICA to try to remove landmines and try to create peace villages. And this is also something that we could bring together and incorporate in terms of peace ODA. This is a museum project in Cambodia. You go, I'm sure some of you have been to the Killing Fields. The digital archiving project has been done by Korea, and this is also a peace ODA project. And in East Timor, this area where it was a political prison for political prisoners, and this has been turned into a peace and human rights museum, which is also a kind of peace ODA project. In Uganda here, there was a peace village that was created for victims of gender violence. It has been suspended for now, and this has to be continued. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, they inaugurated a national museum, and the BBC has said, why is KOICA supporting the Democratic Republic of Congo for this? Because they are trying to help as a former colonial nation, this other nation on what it has been. Our president met with the chairperson in East Timor, and as you can see there, they are talking over soccer ball. There are soccer ball stadiums that were created in East Timor, and all of these different activities that are being implemented in East Timor and Korea. There's also a fair trade enterprise that is selling East Timor peace coffee. So they're bringing in coffee beans from East Timor to engage in these peace ODA activities, and something similar, bringing in olives from Palestine to sell this conflict zone olives as bottled olive oil. So lastly, Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and Peace ODA. This is something that I presented at the Jeju Forum. The Pyeongchang Winter Olympics has not ended with no news. We have the legacy, we have the political legacy, the economic legacy, and cultural legacy. But for us, the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics ended with a peace legacy. This can allow us to come together under city diplomacy, public diplomacy, sports diplomacy, and unification public diplomacy. We had the PPF, the PyeongChang Peace Forum. We've had soccer matches. We've had these PyeongChang Peace Cup, as you can see, and Imagine Peace Youth Camp. We have not seen such sustained activities after any kind of Winter Olympic Games. We've seen this YPC PyeongChang Youth Peace Challenge, and etc. And now leading up to the 2024 Winter Youth Olympic Games, let's meet together. This is very important in the Korean context. Let's meet together. But this is not about just meeting the two Koreas, but that in sports Olympics, we should also try to incorporate cultural Olympics with this, and also bring in a lot of youth peacemaker, youth activists to come here. And as you know, with sports and Olympics, this is where capital plays a big role, and there's also a spirit of nationalism. There's a lot of civic education, but you know that many people say that there is still a nationalistic tendency, that we want to win the gold because we want to beat Japan, for example. This is nationalistic tendency that is still continuing to be present. Now, we can move beyond this kind of nationalistic tendency and try to create a global peace Olympic Games. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now to Anselmo Lee, you can close the session because as you are the organizer of the PyeongChang Peace Foundation, and you have continuously participated in this PyeongChang Peace Forum, and you are a civil society partnership. You are trying to create this for Asia, for SDGs, and I understand that you have miraculously created a multi-faceted different cooperative framework. So please give him a big round of applause.
자, 저는 1분 내 마치도록 하겠습니다.
I will try to be extremely brief and keep my comments within a minute. So I would like to provide a proposal. You can see that we're seeing the end of Beijing Olympics, and I think that it would be great if we can compare the Olympics of Beijing, Tokyo, and Pyeongchang, what the lessons with regard to public diplomacy. So I would like to offer this proposal to Ms. Ryu and Professor Moon and Chung. And Ms. Cho Soo-ji talked about sports and non-sports persons. In the Olympics, we're all spectators. So it would be great if we can find a way for the youth, for those in sports and those that are not sports athletes to come together. And as you know, in 2018, we had the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And in 2019, the Pyeongchang 2018 Legacy Foundation was brought together. So it was centered on sports. And last year, the PyeongChang Peace Center was put together. So this was focused on peace, and the Legacy Foundation focused on sports. So we have Minister Lee and we have Vice President Song. Right now, the reason why I am the director of the foundation is because we really want the peace activists and those in sports in 2024 to come together, break away from politics, from capital, and to create a true event, a sporting event for peace as well as sports. Yes, thank you very much. Korea was a laggard in various aspects, but we became the first country to become a donor recipient from a donor recipient to a donor country. So you can see that we also understand that it's important to make sure that we need to be sensitive to the recipients when we do offer our support. And in the process, we can also promote peace. So I think that Korea is destined to play such a role in the world.
이 평창에서 시작되었다는 거.
And you can see that this momentum all starts from Pyeongchang, which makes it more meaningful. You can see that a global agenda all starts from the localities. So I hope that in the 21st century, we can really see a great promotion of peace around the world, starting from this very local region. I know that we have posed many questions this session rather than answering to these questions, but I hope that we can maybe host another session next time because we didn't have enough time to go into all of these questions. So the agenda that you've mentioned and also the hindrances that was noted by Professor Kim, I think it's important to gather all of these questions together to host another session.
추가로 해마다 2월
And if I may add, the PyeongChang Peace Forum takes place in February, and in September 21st, the UN Peace Day. We also have a similar event that's hosted by the Peace Foundation. So I hope that in September or October, so we can actually engage in further discussions under some beautiful autumn weather. Yes, COVID-19 and this Omicron variant could not stop us. You can see that we have the aspirations for peace, our will and determination still holds true amidst these very difficult times. As mentioned, public diplomacy is key, and I believe that the determination for peace in Pyeongchang will serve as an important asset for peace going forward, and it will also enable us to open up a brighter future for our youth. Thank you very much to all of our participants,
시간을 잘 조정할
and I would like to apologize as moderator for not managing the time. My apologies. And with that, let me close this session. Thank you very much for your attention.
수고하셨습니다.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
참 10시간이라도 드리고
We would
싶지만
like to give you 10 hours if we can, but in the interest of time, we have to close the session now, so that is unfortunate.
하지만 그럼에도 불구하고 이 짧은 시간 속에 굉장히
However, in this very short session, we were able to have a very informative session, so thank you for that.
그리고 또 끝까지 참석해 주신 참석자분들께도 감사하다.
Thank you to all the attendees who have stayed with us until the end.
첫 번째 세션을 모두
With that, we close the Pyeongchang Spirits of Peace and Public Diplomacy session. Thank you very much for coming despite the cold weather.
돌아가십시오. 그리고
Have a safe return. We'll see you back at 1 p.m.
평화 공공외교 두 번째 세션이 진행될 예정입니다. 역시
So we'll see you back for the second session. We ask you for your attendance. Thank you.